Weapons in D&D are the crux of any martial build you can make and are necessary for dealing any amount of damage to your enemies. As such, choosing the right weapon for the right job is crucial to getting the most out of your class. So in today's video, we're going to be going over some of the best weapons that D&D 5e has to offer, as well as going over some of the utility that each weapon can bring to the table. For the purposes of this list, however, we'll only be talking about the weapons that are shown on the weapons table in the player's handbook. So no grenades, alchemist fire, or antimatter rifles. And at number 10, we have the Dagger. This is a simple melee weapon that deals 1d4 piercing damage and possesses the finesse, light, and throwing properties. This weapon is as basic gets, as it has the finesse property, which allows you to use a dex or strength modifier, giving your rogues or dex-based fighters or rangers the ability to use the dagger effectively as well. And it being a light weapon means you can also dual wield them with ease without taking the dual wielding feat. The dagger also allows you to throw at a normal range of 20 feet and a long range of 60. Which can be very useful if a creature is just outside of melee range. This is particularly useful for rogues since they can still benefit from sneak attack damage, as they would still be making a range attack with a finesse weapon, so long as they meet all the other requirements for sneak attack. The dagger is a fantastic starting weapon, not just because of how versatile it is, but also because of the fact daggers can be used by any class in the game right from the beginning of the game, and are usually abundant enough to be hoarded for selling or throwing from range. If that isn't the case, however, and you're strapped for cash, you might prefer just buying a bunch of darts, considering they have the same statistics, with the only difference being that you can't melee with the darts, but are on the cheaper side for being 5 copper pieces per dart over 2 gold pieces per dagger. While this isn't the strongest weapon on this list, the dagger is definitely the most versatile despite its low damage, which makes it an excellent start to this list. And at number 9, we have the whip. Whips are a martial melee weapon and the only weapon in the game that has both a finesse and reach property, allowing you to not only use your dex for its attack and damage roll, but also hit a creature from 10 feet away rather than 5 feet. While it only deals 1d4 slashing damage, what makes the whip so good is its unique combination of finesse and reach, allowing dex-based characters to be a bit more dangerous around the battlefield, especially rogues. You can also add in the slasher feat to make it so that your whip also reduces the target's creature's movement speed by 10 feet, making it that much harder for them to get away from you. Feats aside, however, the whip stands out more than either weapon on this list because it is probably the best and only way for dex-based characters to have a reliable reach option, despite its fairly low damage die. Unfortunately, the biggest downside to this weapon is the fact that it's a martial weapon, which means that most classes aren't going to be able to use the whip unless they build for it, usually by dipping a level of Hexblade Warlock, War Cleric, or another class that grants martial weapon proficiencies, such as fighters and rangers. Even then, there are usually better options to choose from other than the whip, which is why this weapon can't be any higher in this list. And at number 8, we have the heavy crossbow. This ranged martial weapon has a normal range of 100 feet and a long range of 400. Is considered heavy, requires 2 hands to hold it while you shoot, and possesses the unique loading property that only crossbows have. It also deals the highest damage out of any of the available ranged weapons on this list at a whopping 1d10 piercing damage. This can be used for martial characters that are either dex-based or just want to make a ranged attack on their turn for other reasons. For example, a raging barbarian might switch to a crossbow on the turn if a creature is too far away. Doing this, however, won't grant their shot any rage benefits, but they will retain their rage long enough to close the remaining gap on the next turn, since the only stipulation to your rage ending is if you ever don't take damage or make an attack. It doesn't matter what kind of attack. However, because ranged weapons typically use dexterity, you really don't want to use this in place of your main weapon, especially if the damage is what you're going for. Coincidentally enough, the damage of the heavy crossbow is actually the reason why this weapon takes number 8 spot on this list over the light crossbow, despite the light crossbow being a little easier to acquire, being a simple ranged weapon rather than a martial one. It sports the highest damage die of all ranged weapons on the weapons list, and can work well in a one-off shot on your turn, and sports a respectable range of 100 feet before having to make your range attacks a disadvantage when firing at something further than that. However, what keeps the heavy crossbow from being any higher in this list is the fact that it has the loading property, which holds it back. A weapon with a loading property can only be fired once whenever you take your action, bonus action, or reaction to fire it before needing to be loaded again. What this essentially means is that if your fighter can make 3 attacks per action, it can only use 1 of those attacks to fire the crossbow before needing to spend an entire action to load it back up, as loading a crossbow is considered part of the action itself. While this isn't a problem for characters that only attack once per turn, such as a rogue or cleric, it can be unfavorable to use on something like the aforementioned fighter or barbarian, since they would be sacrificing at least 1 attack just to hit something from range. However, like stated before, there are some clear advantages that using a heavy crossbow can have, such as dealing any damage in the first place. You can also take the crossbow expert feat, which grants you the amazing benefit of ignoring the loading property altogether, along with being able to make range attack rolls without suffering disadvantage by having a threatened creature within 5 feet of you, which also applies on ranged spell attack rolls, funnily enough. So, while the heavy crossbow is definitely one of the better weapons on this list in the damage department, it does come with some drawbacks compared to some of the other items on this list, which sport better utility and potential usefulness overall. And at number 7, we have Javelins. These are simple melee weapons that deal 1d6 piercing damage and have the thrown property with a range of 30 feet for its normal distance and 120 feet for its long range distance. While damage of javelins are middling at best, the javelin has something that other weapons don't, a massive throwing distance. While every other thrown weapon has a normal range of 20 and 60 feet, the range of the javelin allows strength-based martials to attack creatures from a more favorable distance than throwing something like a trident or spear, while also dealing slightly more damage than a dagger or dart. And while tridents and spears might be better to use as melee weapons on a day-to-day basis, due to them possessing the versatility property, allowing you to two-hand these weapons and increase their damage die of the melee from 1d6 to 1d8, there are far better versatile weapons you can use for dealing damage, such as a longsword or warhammer, which can be two-handed for 1d10 damage. However, for the sake of throwing alone, the range the javelin has is unmatched by a long shot. As why javelins only take number 7 on this list, it's mostly because their increased range might not be enough to actually put damage on the board whenever you use it. With range attacks being made beyond 30 feet having a disadvantage, it's unlikely you'll be able to hit anything from that far, unless you have a source of advantage to mitigate it. However, because javelins are simple melee weapons with a cheap cost of 5 silver pieces, you can hoard them quite easily and chuck them without fear of losing valuable pieces of equipment, as opposed to spears and tridents, which cost 1 gold and 5 gold apiece respectively. It's also typically better for strength-based characters to throw a javelin rather than shoot a crossbow whenever the situation calls for it. And extra 10 feet of normal range can prove useful in combats when your opponent would just be out of reach of other throwables. All in all, javelins are the best throwing weapon a strength-based character can use, which is why they make it this list over spears and tridents. And at number 6, we have the hand crossbow. This is a ranged martial weapon that deals 1d6 piercing damage and, like other crossbows, possesses the loading property. However, unlike other crossbows, it does contain the light property, allowing you to technically carry 2 of them. This means that you can technically dual-wield two-handed crossbows, and even attack with both of them if you take the crossbow expert feat to allow you to ignore the loading property, and make a bonus action attack with a hand crossbow when you're making an attack with a one-handed weapon. And because of how the feat is worded, this also means that even if you're only carrying one hand crossbow, this feat technically synergizes with itself by allowing you to attack with your hand crossbow, fulfilling the need to attack with a one-handed weapon clause, and then use your bonus action to make another hand crossbow attack. This can be particularly useful for characters that only make one attack, such as a cleric, or grant additional attacks since your crossbow no longer requires you to waste action economy loading it. However, even with the crossbow expert feat, hand crossbows make number 6 on this list for the sole reason that it's kind of in the middle in regards to how good it is compared to other weapons on this list. While it is definitely the most versatile ranged weapon on this list, it does come with a few drawbacks, the most prominent being its range, which is on par with javelins. 30-foot number range and 120-foot long range. You are not going to be sniping long-range targets with your hand crossbow, but there are some special cases where a hand crossbow might be preferable to use over other ranged weapons. For example, a rogue might be wielding a dagger in one hand and a hand crossbow in the other. While you can't fire your crossbow right off the bat as a bonus action, since by default you must have a free hand to load the hand crossbow, what you can do is throw your dagger at a target first to free up one hand before loading and firing your hand crossbow for an extra 1d6 piercing damage. At best, you squeeze out a little bit of extra damage using your bonus action than if you were to throw an offhand dagger, and at worst, you have a second shot at dealing your sneak attack damage if you happen to miss with your first dagger. Overall, the hand crossbow sports a good amount of versatility and decent range for characters that want to have a bit of range without the encumbrance of heavy crossbows, especially since heavy crossbows sport the heavy property, which might come as an inconvenience to smaller races, as heavy weapons impose disadvantage on attack rolls whenever a small creature attempts to use a weapon at all, regardless of whether or not they have proficiency with it, and thus why hand crossbows take a spot on this list. And at number 5, we have the Halberd and Glaive. Both of these are martial melee weapons and share the same exact statistics of being two-handed, heavy weapons with the reach property while also sporting 1d10 slashing damage. Even the cost and weight of both of these weapons are exactly the same, so it makes sense to lump these two together. As for what makes the Halberds and Glaive so special, they are the best reach weapons you can give to a strength-based character, as they possess a good balance of fighting damage and a reach of 10 feet, as opposed to the normal reach of 5 feet. While lances are technically better reach weapons than glaives and halberds by virtue of being able to deal 1d12 damage per hit, lances suffer from having disadvantage on attack rolls against creatures that are within 5 feet of you, meaning you would have to mind your positioning a lot more, whereas halberds and glaives will always deal the same damage no matter where you attack a creature within your 10 feet reach. As for the other reach weapons, whips really only benefit dexterity-based characters, since it's the only reach weapon with finesse. And while pikes share the exact same characteristics as halberds and glaives, with the only difference being the pike deals piercing damage rather than slashing, there's a few reasons why pikes don't share the spot with its slashy brethren. The first reason is that while pikes are significantly cheaper to buy over halberds and glaives, 5 gold apiece as opposed to 20 gold for the latter, pikes weigh over 3 times as much as its counterparts, 18 pounds as opposed to 6, which might pose potential problems depending on how your campaign handles encumbrance. As for the other reason, this most commonly comes down to the potential feat combos. See, unlike pikes, halberds and glaives are 2 of the 4 listed weapons that can benefit from the widely popular polearm feat, which is a feat that allows you to make a bonus action attack whenever you take the attack action with one of the listed weapons, dealing 1d4 plus your attack modifier's bludgeoning damage. You also gain the benefit of being able to also make creatures provoke opportunity attacks whenever they move into your weapon's reach, rather than purely whenever a creature leaves it. Another benefit of having a reach weapon with a heavy property is the fact that it can benefit from the Great Weapon Master feat, which allows you to take a -5 penalty to your attack roll in exchange for a flat plus damage whenever you hit, as well as allowing you to make a bonus action attack with your weapon whenever you land a critical hit, or reduce a creature's hit points to 0, which further increases the effectiveness of these weapons. On top of that, you can also add the Sentinel feat to further make yourself an absolute menace on the battlefield, by making your opportunity attacks reduce the movement speed of enemies to 0 and lets you ignore the disengage action on a creature that's used it, allowing you to make an opportunity attack anyway if you choose so long as you still have a reaction for it, of course. However, because you have to specifically build for this combo by spending at least 2 feats for Polearm Master and Sentinel at the bare minimum, and because this list is about weapons themselves rather than combo potential with feats, the Halberd and Glaives can't be any higher in this list. If this were the case, the Halberds and Glaives would easily rank much higher. That being said, however, the power that having a reach weapon can provide cannot be understated. You can move up to your opponent, slash at them, then safely move away without provoking opportunity attacks, allowing you to either retreat to safety or spread the love to other enemies that you might want to grab attention from, and more easily establish yourself as an immediate threat on the board. But if you find yourself wanting to deal piercing damage and have room to spare, the pike is a good alternative, as long as you're planning to grace your build with Polearm Master. Shooting its way to number 4 on this list is the Longbow. This is a ranged martial weapon that deals 1d8 piercing damage per shot, has a normal range of 150 feet and a long range of 600, and possesses the heavy and two-handed properties. Out of every item on this list, the Longbow is essentially the best long-range weapon you can give to a dexterity-based character, as it sports decent damage, incredible range, and isn't held back by the loading property that the crossbows have, allowing you to shoot the bow as many times as you have the attacks for it. They are essentially better short bows in every way. While most classes don't have immediate access to longbows by default, there are still tons of ways to gain longbow proficiency with minimal to low effort. While elf races can learn how to use longbows, whether it be from their elf weapon training feature or their trance feature, which varies between elf races, hobgoblins are another race which can learn the longbow proficiency due to their martial training feature, which allows them to become proficient in 2 martial weapons, as well as being proficient in light armor as a treat. Alternatively, you can dip 1 level into a class that gains martial weapon proficiencies like Fighter, Ranger, Paladin, or Barbarian. Or you can choose from a subclass that also provides martial weapon proficiencies along with some other benefits, such as the Hexblade Warlock, which is front-loaded with a bunch of unique bonuses, such as Hexblade's Curse, which allows you to add your proficiency bonus to your damage to a creature you apply this curse, provides a minor amount of healing whenever you kill the cursed creature, and, most importantly, increases your critical hit range to 19 to 20, which can be invaluable to a rogue since landing a critical hit with your sneak attack will result in an instant activation of neurons due to the high math rocks you'll be getting to roll. Along with that, you'll even gain access to spells and cantrips like Eldritch Blast, which wouldn't really do much for you as a rogue if you're using a longbow, but can still be useful for other classes or builds. Returning to the main topic at hand, however, the longbow is an incredible weapon to have when going for any sort of range build, since its normal range of 150 feet completely overshadows the normal range of every other ranged weapon on this list. And if you were to take the Sharpshooter feat, which not only grants you the benefits of the Great Weapon Master feat of foregoing accuracy for flat damage, you also get to ignore the disadvantage imposed by using a weapon's long range, which essentially means your longbow would just have a range of 600 feet with no downsides. But even without any feats to worry about, the longbow stands well on its own as being the best long-range weapon for dex-based martials, and even some spellcasters if they can get their hands on longbow proficiency, since even the normal range of a longbow outranges most cantrips and spells they might have, albeit at the cost of a bit of accuracy, since they'll be using their dexterity rather than their spellcasting modifier. That aside, however, what earns longbow its spot on this list is its incredible utility availability it has, while also not sacrificing too much in the way of damage, and being the absolute best at any given role is high enough praise to be put on such a high spot on this list. And at number 3, we have the Rapier. This is a martial melee weapon that deals 1d8 piercing damage and possesses the finesse property. If you ever wanted to maximize the amount of damage you dealt in a single attack as a melee-based martial that uses dex, this weapon is basically the best you can get. It has the highest damage dice of all the finesse weapons and is available to more classes by default than you might think, including rogues and bards. While the biggest downside of wielding a rapier is not being able to dual wield two of them without a feat, as it lacks the light property, the rapier still does more for a character than any other finesse weapon, except it may be a whip for its reach or dagger for its thrown property at the cost of much lower damage. However, when it comes to dual wielding in general, the difference between dual wielding two rapiers over one rapier and one short sword, for instance, is pretty negligible in terms of damage. But in terms of raw damage output from a dexterity-based martial, the rapier definitely shines above the rest, and can even be a rogue barbarian's best friend, which is a popular combination of rogue and barbarian classes that allows you to reckless attack with a rapier for free advantage, while also fulfilling two of the requirements of a sneak attack to proc, since you're attacking with a finesse weapon and have advantage. Just like how Longbow is the best long-range weapon of its class, the rapier takes us on this list for much of the same reason. It's the best melee weapon a dexterity martial can have when it comes to raw damage. And at number 2 on this list, we have the Greataxe. This is a martial melee weapon that has the heavy and two-handed properties and deals a whopping 1d12 slashing damage. The Greataxe is a favorite for half-orcs and barbarians, since they both have ways to increase that damage die, and thus the overall damage of the Greataxe to an extensive degree. Half-orcs gain access to the Savage Attacks feature, which allows them to roll an extra damage die whenever they land a critical hit with a melee weapon attack, meaning that a crit would deal a total of 3d12 damage rather than 2d12 of a normal crit. Barbarians also get a similar feature called Brutal Critical at 9th level, allowing them to also do the same thing while getting stronger over time, adding another damage die at 13th level, and then one more damage die at 17th, giving you meaty crits that can deal up to 4d12 damage before adding your strength mod or your potential rage damage. And if you're half-orc, Savage Attack does stack with Brutal Critical, making your Greataxe swing for 5d12 damage whenever you land a critical hit. The best part about this is that you don't even need to invest anything other than the base features you're given by half-orcs and barbarians. But even outside of being a half-orc or a barbarian, having the highest possible damage dice in the game is an impressive feat, as the only other weapon in the game that matches it is the Lance, which comes with both an upside and a downside in comparison. As mentioned previously, the Lance does have the reach property, allowing you to attack creatures from 10 feet instead of the standard 5 feet, but forces disadvantage on attack rolls if you're trying to attack something that's within the standard 5 feet reach of you, which forces you to really think about your position on the battlefield to squeeze out that 1d12 piercing damage it does. This is because the Lance is technically supposed to be used while mounted, which is supposed to make it a bit easier to handle, as it doesn't require two hands to wield while you're mounted, which adds a bit of flexibility over other weapons, such as allowing you to have a shield at the same time while using a lance, a feature no other two-handed weapon allows, including the Greataxe. However, since mounted combat is rare in most campaigns, the Greataxe still comes out on top due to its simplistic nature of just needing to hit a target to deal big damage. As for why the Greataxe takes number 2 on this list, it's mostly because, outside of being a half-orc or a barbarian, there's one set of weapons that have a bit more flexibility and utility than the Greataxe, and those weapons are, at number 1, we have the Greatsword and the Maul. These martial melee weapons deal 2d6 slashing and 2d6 bludgeoning damage respectively, and possess the heavy and two-handed properties. While neither of these weapons have the massive damage die of a Greataxe, the average damage of the Greatsword or Maul is actually slightly higher than the Greataxe, but only just barely. Not only that, but due to having two smaller damage dice to work with, Greatswords and Mauls tend to swing more consistently than Greataxes. This is because the Greataxes have an equal chance to land on any number from 1 to 12. Whereas a Greatsword or Maul will have the greatest chance to roll its average damage due to having more paths to that average. To put it another way, the only way a Greataxe can roll its average damage of 6 is by rolling a 6. Whereas, for a Greatsword or Maul to roll its average damage of 7, it can roll a 6 and 1, a 5 and 2, 4 and 3, and so on and so on. The end result is that with a Greatsword or Maul, you have a much lower chance to roll minimum or maximum damage, but a higher chance to roll average or consistent damage overall. Whereas a Greataxe has a much higher chance at a Greatsword or Maul to roll minimum or maximum damage, but less chance to roll more consistent average. While this alone doesn't really make one weapon better than the other, it might be an important distinction for players that might want a weapon that feels more consistent to them, rather than a weapon that may deal big damage sometimes, and tiny amounts of damage at others. More importantly, however, Greatswords and Mauls have incredible synergy with great weapon fighting style that paladins and fighters have access to, as it allows you to reroll any 1s and 2s you roll into damage with your two-handed melee weapon attacks and use the new rolls. While the Greataxe benefits from this feature as well, what makes it so great for Mauls and Greatswords is the fact that it essentially makes these weapons even more consistent than they already are. As mentioned before, Greatswords and Mauls have a much lower chance of rolling low or high damage than Greataxes. So as a result, great weapon fighting helps lower the chances of rolling low, while also raising the chances of rolling average or high on a weapon that's already rolling pretty consistently overall. While we're comparing different features to each other, Greataxes do have one thing over Greatswords that we've already covered. better savage attacks, and brutal criticals. See, both these features add an additional damage die whenever a player lands a critical hit. This means that while a Greataxe's damage ends up being a total of 3d12 slashing damage, or an average of 19.5 damage with brutal critical, a Maul or Greatsword would only gain an additional 1d6, which would result in a total of 5d6 damage, or an average of 17.5 damage over the normal 4d6 or 14 average critical hit damage. This means that, mathematically speaking, you'd always want to take a Greataxe over a Greatsword or Maul when making use of those features. Overall, whether you want to use a Greataxe, Greatsword, or Maul will mostly come down to player preference. Overall consistency of the Greatsword and Maul make them just a little bit more favorable to using them amongst all the classes that have access to them over the Greataxe, which is why Greatswords and Mauls take number 1 spot on this list. And that's the list. What are some of your favorite weapons to use in your campaigns? Are there any weapons you think are underrated that you'd like to see talk about? Or do you have ideas for future videos like this one? I'd love to hear about them down in the comments below. And take care.